Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Black Public Square podcast. I am your host, Dr. Emmett Riley. This week we start with the profound question, or at least quote by the late great Toni Morrison. If you can only be tall because someone else is on their knees, then you have a serious problem. End quote. In this famous interview, Toni Morrison talked about the practice of racism. And she asked a provocative question. She asked white people, who are you without racism? Are you still smart? Are you still beautiful? Do you love yourself? She went on to say, those who practice racism are bereft, and that there's something distorted in their psyche. So if racism disappears tomorrow, who are white people without the European standards of beauty? Who are you? Do you feel love? Are you smart? Are you still powerful if there is no group left for you to oppress? Most Americans recognize obvious examples of white supremacy. It's easy to identify the Klan. It's easy to identify neo-Nazis. And even though we have some mainstream politicians today who still have issues distancing themselves from these groups, most Americans recognize objectively that organizations like the Klan or neo-Nazis or Dylann Roofs or the individuals who marched in Charlottesville who said Jews will not replace us are on any objective measure white supremacist groups. But those are very what we call low-hanging fruit examples. It becomes much more difficult for Americans to recognize white supremacy as an ideology, make distinctions between white supremacy and white nationalism, and also linking in what is this new consciousness of white identity that many political scientists are now starting to examine. What happens, however, when racial hierarchies no longer looks extreme, but instead they are manifested in ordinary engagements of politics? Today's discussion, we will unpack the extent to which white supremacy has become normalized within the American context. But before moving into this conversation, I think it's important to set some parameters and to talk about some terms and make some distinct definitions between terms like white supremacy, white nationalism, white identity, and things of that nature. White supremacy, if we take one simple conception of it, is a belief that white people should occupy a superior position in society and that institutions should preserve that hierarchy. It asks many questions like, who should occupy the top of the racial hierarchy? It's predicated on practices like slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, explicit racial discrimination, and policies that are designed to preserve white dominance in society. White nationalism, on the other hand, expressed in a concept by Ronald Walters, who was a prominent political scientist who served on the faculty at Howard University and one of the most influential political scientists of our time. We define white nationalism as an ideology arguing that the nation should primarily serve white people and that government should preserve white political, economic, and cultural dominance. This particular concept deals with the idea of who does America really belong to? It engages in debates around immigration policies, debates around who is a citizen, debates around voting policy. We hear it wrapped up in language like we should take our country back. And we've even seen some close to this current administration advance the Great Replacement theory. White identity politics, however, is a political behavior in which white's identity becomes politically important and shapes political attitudes and voting behavior. It sort of deals with central questions like how important is being white to a person's identity. There's some important work by Ashley Jardina's work, White Identity Politics, and in this work, she unpacks some examples of the politics of white grievance, demographic threats, and protections of perceived white interest. And of course, I study white racial resentment, which is an attitudinal measure of negative white racial attitudes that makes assessments about blacks violating the Protestant work ethic, blacks not working hard enough, and that blacks' failure is a result of their own inability to take advantage of opportunities presented to them, more so than structural discrimination like slavery. We know that resentment explains policies, support for affirmative action, evaluations of political candidates, opposition to race conscious policies, and it also predicts political behavior in terms of voting. The Southern Poverty Law Center has tracked the rise of white supremacy organizations in the United States and have found in recent years that white supremacist organizations are now on the rise in this particular country. It should come as no surprise as we have a president who advanced to office by disparaging immigrants, who have advanced policies to allow white South Africans amnesty in the United States while denying black countries that are majority African or black or Central America from entering this particular country. All of these concepts are related, but they're also distinct, but all of them builds on the white hierarchy that seeks to advance and preserve the interests of whites in America. Ronald Walter's work, White Nationalism, Black Interests, Conservative Public Policy, and the Black Community. In this book, Walters argues that white nationalism represents a radical form of conservatism that seeks to use official and unofficial power of the state to preserve white dominance through the subordination of black people and other racial minorities. So what does this mean? The official use of government power is often wielded through the influence of public policy. It is often through the election of political candidates that advance policies that are going to disadvantage blacks while preserving and protecting whites. Unofficial power is those unofficial channels where political strategy is employed. It's through the Southern strategy where Richard Nixon famously wanted to campaign in a way that will recruit whites who were disgruntled with the Democratic Party into the Republican column. Now, in Ronald Walter's work, White Nationalism, Black Interest, he argues that there are four dominant structures that allows white people to sort of form this formation of a white national identity. He argues that most white people form their identity on the basis of a common European heritage, whether that be immigrants from Poland, from England, or from some part of Europe. Whites have this distinctive culture that defines and links them to the continent of Europe. The second dimension of the making of white nationalism, according to Walters, is that whites in America typically practice racial separation from other groups, such as mass movement away from black communities known as white flight, the creation of all-white segregation academies, and even within the American context, the creation of a university system that is predominantly white and seeks to exclude and keep its doors shut to blacks. Although Brown versus the Board of Education formally eliminated segregation, it did very little to change the hearts and minds of whites and to create spaces on these white campuses that are welcoming and conducive to the learning and the advancement of blacks on these campuses. The third dimension that Walters talks about is that whites have a cultural notion of whiteness which brings together a distinct set of racial attitudes towards non-white groups. This manifests in the form of stereotypes about other groups being violent or lazy. These attitudes typically unify white Americans around their understanding of race and racial politics in America. And finally, Walter argues that whites maintain control over most of the principal institutions within the American political system. For example, if you look at many of the statewide offices, they're primarily in the hands of whites. If we look at the composition of our national government, it is primarily in the hands of whites. And what we know from the congressional representation literature in political science is that when institutions look a certain way, they typically serve one group at the expense of another group. This raises the idea of in-group versus out-group hostility. If we're thinking about white nationalism as this idea that the government should serve the interests of the state, then it makes sense what some of the things that we're seeing happening in our government. As there has been a purging of blacks from the Pentagon, a purging of blacks from the federal government, a rooting out of DEI from college campuses. We've seen amnesty programs that have been advanced by this government, this regime, to make immigrant policies more friendly towards European and white African nations versus those of black nations. We've also seen some very extreme cases when it comes to white supremacy and white nationalism in the United States. We've seen Dylann Roof walk into a church and assassinate black people while they were in Bible study. We've seen individuals like Charlie Kirk, who dropped out of a community college, yet was invited to some of the most prestigious institutions in our nation to debate and shout at college kids. And we were told that that was the correct way to practice politics versus engaging in civil discussion that did not question the humanity of black and brown people. At the heart of white nationalism is political dominance about power. As black people received rights after the civil rights movement, whites interpreted the imposition and the expansion of political rights to African Americans as taking away the rights that belong to their community. As Ronald Walters talks about, historically, every single time that blacks have made a claim to equality in America, it has been followed by a period of what he calls this radical form of conservatism that seeks to use both official and unofficial power to advance its agenda. You see, in Ronald Walters' work, he talks about the equilibrium. And the equilibrium, as a metaphor to compare the American system, has been that the American political system has always been structured around whiteness. This whiteness has resulted in racialized policies, segregation, Jim Crow, immigrant policies that seek to exclude black people, hateful Supreme Court cases like Louisiana versus Calais, like Dred Scott versus Stanford. We've seen other important cases as it relates to other groups such as Georgia versus Cherokee Nation, many cases that relegated non-white groups or out groups as subordinate to the white standard. Yet many white people believe that I'm not a white supremacist. I'm not a white nationalist. Yet they support policies that align with the interests of white nationalist organizations. One of the greatest mistakes after the civil rights movement is that we allowed people to frame discussions around voting rights, desegregation, the expansion of political rights to black people as a partisan debate. And when in fact this was not just simply a partisan debate, it was a debate about the humanity of black people who had been enslaved in this country since at least 1616. Another particular argument that Walters makes is that when there is a disruption to the equilibrium, it's followed by this extreme conservatism. As black people get rights, we see there is a period of retrenchment and political retribution. We saw this after slavery. We saw this after the Reconstruction period. We've seen it after the Civil Rights era. And we're now seeing it in modern times with the manifestation of one of the major political parties in the United States now have become mainstream, now have allowed racism to become part of the mainstream core political agenda that has served as an organizing element. You don't have to take my words for it. Take the vice president's words, who went to a political organization and said that we as Republicans can't choose our voters must choose us. This was a debate about whether or not the party should make room for those who espouse those extreme attitudes like anti-Semitism, anti-blackness, and anti-racism. But yet the difference now is that there was a time in American politics where explicit racial appeals were not successful in mobilizing white voters because they did not want to be seen as racist. Well, after the Obama period, we've seen an activation of these negative attitudes and an activation of elites using racism as a motivating factor to turn out their political base. So when we think about debates about voting rights, debates about segregation, debates about affirmative action, debates about colorblind policies, all these things are part of the larger structure of what I call preserving white supremacy. And too often we think of white supremacy as, oh, it's just the Klan. But there's a structure to white supremacy as a framework, right? When we begin to think about the structure of white supremacy, the denial of privilege, the minimization of black people's experience, right? The outright calling for white domination. We live in what is supposed to be a democratic model for the world. Yet in the last 20 years, we have experienced more white supremacy hate in this country than we've seen in our lifetime. We've seen black men be hunted down in Georgia and brutally murdered. We've seen Dylan Ruth walk into the Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina, a church that was a symbolic pillar of the civil rights movement, and they're assassinated execution style as they invited him in to worship with them. We've seen so many extremities with respect to white supremacy, and now we're seeing the conversation of white supremacy shift into conversations about, oh, we oppose diversity, equity, and inclusion. Oh, creation of majority black districts are somehow constitutionally discriminatory against white people. We're seeing a rewriting and removal of the true history of this country, removed and whitewashed by every single segment of our federal government. We're also seeing politicians elected both to state houses and to the federal government and to the federal legislature who have associations with white supremacy organizations. I'm thinking of Mike Collins from the state of Georgia, whose son-in-law has called for the white domination of this country, who has called for the removal of individuals who are not part of what he calls the core founding of this particular nation. The question that I think so many of us have to ask is, how extreme does this have to get for many of us to wake up and to recognize what is happening before our eyes? Because ultimately, white supremacy calls for the genocide of those who are black and brown and those who are not at the top of the hierarchy. Another book that I think is instrumental in understanding the mainstreaming of racism into American politics is this book by Richard C. Fording and his colleague. It's called Hard White. In Hard White, he argues that partly we can explain the rise of Donald Trump because he was able to motivate voters who already possessed negative attitudes and who were also motivated by out-group hostility. He argues in particular that Trump took advantage of this movement when he rose to political power by campaigning and motivating these particular individuals to turn out. Simply put, and I'm reading from his text, it says, "We agree that Trump did a lot to attract white nationalists to his campaign, more so than any major political candidate since George Wallace in 1972. But while Trump's presence may have been a necessary condition, it was hardly sufficient condition for the mainstreaming of racism in American politics. As we argue, Trump's racially conservative base was already in place by the time he launched his campaign in 2015, having awoken and mobilized by resistance to Barack Obama's presidency. Second, and following from this misconception regarding the primacy of Trump is the misconception that Trump succeeded because Americans became more racist. Actually, Trump succeeded despite the fact that Americans actually became less racist, at least during the critical period between 2012 and 2016. He argues that part of the mainstreaming of racism in American politics can be traced back to elites taking advantage of the racial proclivities and the racial sensitivities and the racial prejudice of white Americans. But also we've seen an increase in mass polarization around issues of race. Think about it. When people say they oppose affirmative action, they become very offended if you say that you're advancing a white nationalist or white supremacist idea. But the idea that one in a country that has experienced 200 plus years of chattel slavery and nearly another 100 years of Jim Crow after the Civil War, and a person would oppose policies that are designed to level the playing field, what ideology is that upholding? If we go back to Walter's conception of white nationalism as a radical form of conservatism that seeks to use official and unofficial power to maintain white dominance, then we can understand that opposition to affirmative action is about maintaining white dominance in seats of power. If we use that definition, what is the principle that would allow one to oppose a group who has historically been excluded from political participation and a group that remains underrepresented from the franchise of voting and fair representation? Partisanship can't simply explain that. It has to be predicated on an ideology that fundamentally objects to Black people and brown people's claim to what Ronald Walters called equality in his work, White Nationalism, Black Interest. But make no mistake about it. If we only think about white supremacy and white nationalism only through the terms of conservatism and walk away thinking that only conservatives espouse those ideas, we miss a major mark. We know that white liberals and white liberals also espouse and can uphold and maintain white nationalism and white supremacy. We've seen it in how they behave. We've seen it in objections to identity politics. We've seen it with the minimalization of Black people's experiences on a daily basis. One of the interesting things that Hart White talks about in this book, The Mainstreaming of American Politics, is this idea of in-group versus out-group hostility. And within the American context, in-group versus out-groups, we typically study, or at least political science typically study, in-group as the white group. And that those who are inside a particular group will exemplify a higher degree of tolerance and favoritism towards members of their own group, in this case, the white race, and exemplify higher degrees of hostility towards those outside the group. This is why the Southern strategy was so important in segmenting and cementing whites who were pissed off about the Democratic Party adopting civil rights, and many of them left the party. And for a long time, Democrats were unable to win a presidential race because they had lost an important segment of their base. This is known as the Great Realignment and also the use of the Southern strategy. Bill Clinton, despite the fact that he is revered as a Democratic president and also very popular to some degree among African Americans, was a mastermind when it came to organizing and mobilizing and speaking to the concerns and grievances of these white voters in the South who had left the Democratic Party and had voted for many years for the Republican Party after, when Republicans would engage in racialized campaigns and dog whistles that would attract them to their particular party. We saw this in Bill Clinton's crime bill, which was endorsed and supported across the board by all people of all walks of political life in the legislature. We've seen this in Bill Clinton's reform to welfare policies. We've seen this in a number of policies that was not just espoused by Bill Clinton, and that is the beauty of Ronald Walters' work. Walters talks from administration to administration to talk about the opposition that the Reagan administration exemplified towards busing, towards policies that were allowed to advance Black interests. We see Reagan was instrumental and creating this fictitious idea of the welfare queen, this idea that there was a black woman who drove a Cadillac, who had minks, but she was getting rich off of the government. That was a lie. We saw this in George H.W. Bush's use of the Willie Horton ad, the White Hands ad. And we've seen so many of these ads now that speak to the racial hostility and the racial proclivities of different groups across the United States. In addition to thinking about racism as sort of the mainstreaming of it, one of the reasons why racism has become mainstream is because within American political discourse, a person can engage in objectively racist behavior, yet they will deny point blank, oh, that's not racism. Oh, what did they mean? They might not have meant it that particular way. And I argue in my own work that racism always thrives by denying an objective reality of people who live through it and experience it. Donald Trump came down those stairways in Vegas where he said that immigrants were rapists, and he used other language to disparage them. And yet people still objected and said, no, that wasn't racism. Charlie Kirk, God rest his soul, went around the college campuses alleging that black women did not have brain processing power. Yet people still looked us in our face and told us what we were hearing did not fit the mold of racism. And even when there are objective cases of racism, people will still excuse it. Look at the Democratic Party, how the Senate race in Maine has blown up in their face because a Nazi tattoo was not enough to disqualify a person. Even among the most progressive wing of the Democratic Party, the Bernie Sanderses, the Elizabeth Warren camps, we still see a heightened level of anti-black racism that exists even in the wings of this party. Look at the rhetoric after Kamala Harris's defeat, where many on the left said we have to get rid of this DEI policy or this identity politics and get back to speaking to the concerns of working class Americans. And what many said after the 2024 elections is that the party has to speak to the concerns of working class voters, but they did not have the gall to say we really want to speak to the concerns of the working white class voters, as if black voters wasn't concerned about the economy as well. And so what does white nationalism look like today? If we're thinking about white nationalism as sort of this and how it has become normalized, we see it chopped up in debates about immigration, right? We see this particular administration's preference for white South Africans over black South Africans. We've seen mass deportations, in some cases in which American citizens have been caught up in this particular catastrophe and shipped to foreign lands and imprisoned. We've seen a president who issued an unconstitutional executive order on birthright citizenship that was just struck down by the Supreme Court. We're seeing attacks on black history as schools and school districts are banning materials that they disagree with that speaks about slavery and the experiences of black people in this nation. We're seeing some seminal texts like The Souls of Black Folk, like Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, like Stokely Carmichael's Black Power, books that are currently being banned from libraries. We're seeing restrictions on how university professors can teach in states like Texas. We've seen states like North Carolina Board of Trustees move to restrict the granting of tenure to black women who are overly qualified and deserving of such an appointment. We've seen just this year, as the nation celebrated its 250th anniversary, white supremacists flood Washington, D.C. to celebrate the country's founding. We've seen this administration even attempt to set up a reparations fund for those who invaded and attacked police officers and the United States Capitol. Even on my own campus, we've seen white supremacy relics hung in the Confederate cemetery, giving odes to those who died for a lost cause. In the realm of elections, we've seen the Roberts Court, more than any court in modern history, rule against racial and ethnic minorities time and time again. Just a few weeks ago, we got the decision in Louisiana versus Calais. 10 years earlier, the Supreme Court started to weaken the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County. We've seen individuals elected to Congress, elected to state houses, state secretary of states, and state clerks. Some who held the line to defend fair and free elections, and others who bent to political pressure. We've seen the denial of fair representation. And yet, even as we've seen all of these, the more extreme cases that we have witnessed have been Charlottesville, where a young lady was murdered for simply protesting, where neo-Nazis marched and said, Jews will not replace us. Individuals who have assassinated and targeted and have attacked Black people. The January 6th insurrection. We've seen the rise of political influencers like Charlie Kirk and Laura Loomer, who engage in some of the most racially hateful language that we've seen, yet they look at us and say, that's not racism. We've also seen multiple corporations bow in humble submission to an administration that seeks to limit Black mobility, that seeks to keep Black people suppressed, that have targeted Black communities, and that have made economic conditions in this country almost intolerable to those who have suffered the most. You see, part of the hierarchy when it comes to understanding white supremacy is that indifference enables white supremacy. It enables it. And part of the new conversation that's happening is the emergence of white Christian nationalism, where racism becomes cloaked into the identity of these white Christians all across the nation. We think about a second level of white supremacy is the denial of racism, that race no longer matters, that we live in a racial colorblind society despite the fact that there are wide disparities in housing, economic opportunity, mobility. And you can't simply say that class explains all of that or that not working hard explains all of that. It has to be something else. Level 3, we see the minimalization of Black people's suffering and suggesting somehow that our suffering is exaggerated. Level 4, the denial, the defense of a racial hierarchy. Somehow, that having DEI offices on campus that serve students who don't feel comfortable, who experience racial trauma, who don't have access to the equal distribution of the campus's resources, be labeled as, oh, this is unfair to everyone else. And while many people who espouse to be allies to Black people simply turned their heads and said nothing, as more than 300,000 Black women were put out of work as a result of this administration. We've seen also opposition to affirmative action, opposition to voting rights. Level 5 of the white supremacy hierarchy typically is centered around explicit forms of discrimination and open hostility that seeks to exclude people solely on the basis of race. And here intent doesn't matter, because there are a lot of policies that are instituted where they may say that they don't have a racial intent, but the intent and the effect of it is nonetheless the same. And level 6, genocide, open violence, the murdering of different groups, political terrorism that exists. As Toni Morrison said, those who practice racism have a serious problem. And I agree. White people have to decide what are they going to do about it. Because the same white supremacy that has been allowed to target the political rights, protections of Black people, The same white supremacy that has infiltrated political institutions, state legislatures, executive governorships, mayor offices. I'm thinking of my home state, Mississippi, right now, where Nolan Wells' family is forced to bury their child with so many unanswered questions about it. But as Black people in this country, we don't have the privilege to say that it isn't about race because we're taught that we have to question everything. So why does this matter? If democracy assumes equal citizenship and white nationalism assumes unequal belonging, these represent two competing versions of the American democratic experience. One that seeks to extend rights, primarily espoused in social movements by Black people, and one that seeks to limit citizenship, to limit voting rights, to limit equal protection, to limit public education, and to even delegitimize democratic institutions such as voting, the franchise, the peaceful transition of power. You see, white supremacy is a cancer. It's a mental condition. It's an intentional direction of insecurities at Black and brown people in this particular country. And it threatens the very fabric of American democracy. It threatens the very lives that we live. But as we continue to operate in a multiracial democracy, what we have to ask is, once white supremacy is finished coming for Black and brown communities, who next will it look to? One of the classic examples of this is that America for a long time has been an imperial colonial power. Militarism, expansion, conquest. And even as we see Donald Trump as president of the United States, who has turned his eye to Greenland, who has turned his eye to Canada, it is a profound thing to witness a bunch of colonizers fighting amongst themselves. As we think about white supremacy, we got to think about what can we do about it. Black people, we have no permanent allies in this country. But what we must do is reimagine a Black politics, as Michael Dawson talks about, that focuses on organizing Black communities in levels that we've not seen before. We've got to utilize our churches, our universities, our institutions, our political capital, our dollars, and we have to be more intentional about how we are connecting with each other. White supremacy is a cancer that I believe won't go anywhere in our lifetime. But one of the things I know is that Black people, we can be the chemo to white supremacy. Every time we dare and make a claim for equality, we chip away at one of the hierarchies of white supremacy. They may attempt to erase history. They may attempt to rewrite our stories, but they can never come for our tenacity, our gall, our resolve, and our ability to adjust, readjust, and regroup and continue to overcome this experiment. America is at a very fragile place. Every institution that we look to is under attack. But what we know is that our ancestors faced chattel slavery. They faced lynchings. They faced Reconstruction. They faced these white nationalist movements. And every single time we have regrouped, reorganized, and we have emerged better than we were before. Thank you for tuning in to another segment of the Black Public Square. Join me next week as we shift the conversation to, have the American university system become too political? And if so, what can we do about it? Why are people labeling it as political now? And what is this debate about the American university system becoming political? What is it really about? Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this particular segment. The works that I've referenced this week is Hard White, the Mainstreaming of Racism in American Politics, White Identity Politics by Ashley Jardina, and of course, my favorite work, White Nationalism, Black Interest, the Black Community and Conservative Public Policy by Ronald Walters. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this particular segment.